Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us from all over the world for our event, Games People Play, the Legacy of Games of Ancient Iran from Polo to Backgammon. My name is Negar Siari. I'm a PhD candidate in linguistics and a teaching assistant in the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University. If at any time you'd like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box so that we can address that question during our designated Q&A portion. As always, questions are welcome in English, Finglish, and Farsi. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Dr. Farima Mostofi.
خانم آقایان سلام. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to the 16th webinar in our Jari News lecture series. Today's program is titled The Legacy of Games of Ancient Iran from Polo to Backgammon. We really appreciate your presence today and your interest in our cultural events. We are planning to have 2 events this semester, and you can expect to receive more information about this soon. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Shahrzad and Farhad Jarinus. Without their help, these important cultural events would not have taken place. Now I'm pleased to present you our panelists, Dr. Houshang Shahabi, Emeritus Professor of History and International Relations from Boston University, and Dr. Willem Floor, Iranologist and author, as well as our moderator, Mrs. Kangarloo. Tara Kangarloo is award-winning Iranian-American journalist who has previously worked with news outlets such as NBC, CNN, CNN International, and Al Jazeera America. She's also the author of the award-winning book, The Heartbeat of Iran, that provides an extraordinary insight into the many nuances and complexities of life in Iran in today's Iran. She's currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, teaching at the intersection of journalism and public diplomacy. I turn to you, dear Mrs. Kangarloo, and thank you all for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor Mostofi, and everyone at the Iranian Studies Center at Georgetown, and all of you viewers from around the world who are listening in and will later on find our video. It is so good to be back with you all, and it is my pleasure to introduce our very 2 distinct speakers today, and I personally look forward to learning from them both in this very unique subject matter that I have to admit I don't know much about, and I look forward to our very exciting and rich discussion. Dr. Houshang Shahabi is a professor of international relations and history emeritus at Boston University, as Professor Mostofi mentioned. He's also an honorary professor in School of History at the University of St. Andrews. He has published 3 monographs and 12 edited volumes, plus many articles. Among his published articles, 7 deal directly with the history of sports in Iran, including football, polo, wrestling, Zulkhane. And Zulkhane, this is one that we're going to discuss. Dr. Willem Floor, as Dr. Mostofi mentioned, he's an author and Iranologist. He has studied development economics and non-Western sociology, as well as Persian, Arabic, and Islamology from 1963 to 67 at the University of in Netherlands. Since 1983, Dr. Floor was employed by the World Bank as an energy specialist. However, after his retirement in 2002, he has dedicated his time to the study of the social and political history of Iran and has published extensively throughout his time. I believe you mentioned 16 books, Dr. Floor. I'm not sure if if I'm allowed to mention all the names, but these books range for time purposes, of course. But the books range from agriculture in Qajar, Iran, and the history of theater in Iran, as well as the Persian Gulf, a political and economic history of 5 port cities from 1500 to 1730, all the way to the natural gateway of Southeast Iran, and the 5th volume of it, which is the Persian Gulf links with the hinterland, Bushehr, Borazjan, Kazerun, Banu Kab, and Bandar Abbas, and so forth. The list is very long and fascinating, and I sure look forward to learning a whole lot from you both in our discussion. So, legacy of games in ancient Iran. I pose the question to you both, and we'll ask you to start our conversations with this. Tell us a little bit about this legacy and its significance to Iranian culture and heritage. Dr. Shahabi, if you will.
My specialty is not so much games as such, but more the athletic tradition. So for this particular question, I'd like to defer to Dr. Floor in particular, since the only game that comes to us from ancient times, namely polo, was forgotten in Iran in the 17th century. So there's no continuity between the game of polo in ancient times and the game of polo in the 20th and 21st century. And for that reason, in terms of legacy, I'd like to ask Dr. Floor to chime in.
Of course, and we are going to get into polo momentarily, but I wanted to have you both answer the question. Dr. Floor, tell us a little bit about the legacy of games in Iran, if you will.
Tell him to unmute.
Sir, if you can unmute yourself, we can then
mute. I said I'm not a specialist in games either. I'm a specialist in ignorance, and in order to reduce my ignorance, I write books and articles, and then I display my ignorance by having a book. For everything you want to know about games in Iran is in here. Now, as many of you probably will know, Iranians are very playful people, especially with language. And as a result of which, they have many games. There is an inventory of Iranian games that listed at least 2,500, and that was even short. I found many more. So I wouldn't be surprised around 3,000. Now, there is an enormous, let's say, continuity in Iranian games from the Achaemenid times till today. I think, let's say, the oldest game that we know of that from historical text is the one from Xenophon's report. I'm very bad at names. I never can remember book titles, etc. Anyway, it's about Cyrus the Great, and he writes, for example, that Cyrus, when he was a young man, played a game in the village, and I don't go into particulars of the game, and he won. Now, that same game is nowadays known as Wazir, and is still played. It's a rather violent game, a nasty game, actually, but it shows, let's say, that there is an enormous continuity. At the same time, I'd like to add, like in the rest of the world, in Iran also, people don't play the ancient games any longer. They are fading away thanks to television and other things that take people away from culture.
Dr. Shahabi, can you start by telling us about polo? I know that is your specialty, and from there I want to kind of delve deep and hear Dr. Floor's thoughts on what do games tell us about the ancient Persian society and sort of the modern age as we move through the years. What can we learn about the society? But first, Dr. Shahabi, to you, tell us about ancient polo in Iran.
Yeah, my research has shown that polo originates probably in the Parthian dynasty, because in the Achaemenids we have no evidence of them playing polo. Can I have photo number 1, please? There you see that Parthia is in the northeast of Iran. This is the original Parthia. Can I come to the second photo, please? Now, here we have the empire that these Parthians founded, and you see that much of the empire extended into Central Asia. This is the area east of the Caspian Sea. And this is a step in which horses were very prominent in the culture of the people. And so all over this area, we have various games that pitted teams of riders against each other. It has nothing to do with ethnicity. It's just the peoples living here, whatever their ethnicity was, shared these games because this was an area that was conducive to this game. And today, in today's world, we find a remnant of that in the game of Buzkashi. Can I have picture number 3? Which is played in Afghanistan by the Uzbeks originally, but now by all Afghans. So since the Parthian Empire did extend to Central Asia, I think it is logical to assume that the Iranian polo tradition originates in northwest, in the northeast of the country. In the northeast of the country, that the area that used to encompass parts of Central Asia. And there is actually an ancient text which tells us that the founder of the Sasanian dynasty, Ardashir, was called to the court of the last Parthian king, Ardavan V, where they actually played polo. And so it was transmitted from the Parthians to the Sasanians. And can I have the next picture, please? From the Sasanians, it went to China because, as we all know, with the Muslim conquest of Iran in the 7th century, hundreds of thousands of Iranians migrated via the Silk Road to China, where they propagated some of their cultural practices, including polo. And here we see polo players from the Tang dynasty. And from then on, polo became an international game. It was propagated to the east and to the west. What it shows us is part of aristocratic culture in Iran, because not everybody can play polo. It always remained in the Middle Ages up to the 17th century a game of rulers, shahs, aristocrats, be it in Iran, be it outside Iran, and I can tell you about the areas that it spread to from Iran. And so it never became a popular game in the sense, because it's a complicated game. One has to have the time to dedicate oneself to training, to practice. Maintaining horses is expensive. And so it is really was always part of Iranian elite culture. And that's why it was temporarily stopped in the Iranian Revolution of 1979.
Sir, can you, Dr. Shahabi, can you perhaps dig a little bit deeper into sort of the caste system that existed in the time and pertaining to polo, and you did touch on it. were women at all involved in the game of polo? What was the role of women? From my very limited knowledge, I do know that women would join sort of Qajar royals in hunting. You know,
Yeah.
would do horseback riding. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of women, if
Yeah.
you can, in that time?
In the Shahnameh, we have episodes of princesses joining in. But of course, the Shahnameh cannot be taken literally. And the fact that women are mentioned as playing polo in the Shahnameh doesn't tell us that, in fact, they did. Where women did join the game was in China. And in Chinese sources, we have miniatures, we have paintings of women also playing polo. But I have seen no source indicating that in Buyid or in Safavid times women played polo. I doubt it very much.
Very, very well. Dr. Floor, sort of following up on that thread, in the sort of Sassanid era and Hachamaneshi era, can you share some games that perhaps women were involved, or some of the games that you like to highlight from that ancient time? And then we sort of slowly would move to the modern era.
Well, women, of course, didn't play a very public role, whether it was in the imperial period or in the Islamic period, and therefore they do not appear very much in historical texts. Nevertheless, we have a few instances where indeed they played, especially, of course, in popular games. For example, at Alak Dolak, for example, which is a very popular game that was played. I'm not sure whether it's still played. Tic-tac, I think it's called in English, which is not played either any longer. Had actually a female variant for girls, and so there were no mixed games, but girls played that. Then there was also a sort of special kind of game. It was a role-playing game, what I call theoretical games, which again testifies to the continuity of games in Iran, because they were basically, I think, enactments of religious ritual, and they had to do with the annual renewal of the earth, either directly related to Nowruz, the New Year, which basically stands, let's say, in the ancient times, whether it was, let's say, pre-Iranian, like in Babylonian, Assyrian, and later also in the Iranian times, every year the world was transformed into the original matter, chaos, and out of chaos the world was reborn. That's why we have also the Nowruz practical. One of these games, for example, which was typical male, was the Mir Nowruzi, which was actually in some instances still being played in Iran until I would say certainly 100 years ago. But let's say for females, for example, there was the enactment of giving birth, for example. And that was a special thing, was only played by women, for women, no males, because it was very sexually explicit. And they went through all the stages, what happened, etc. And was basically illustrating the rebirth of the world. The same, let's say, for sort of games that brought about, let's say, the importance of water. And
I'm sorry, but can I just interrupt you? Right, this is so fascinating. When was this? What period are we talking about? Especially with the sort of reenactment of giving birth, I'm curious.
Oh, that was still being played, let's say, in the 50s and the 60s, and it may still be, although I doubt it, because Iran has so transformed and nowadays. I have no doubt, let's say, that in some out of the way villages, these things may still be being done, and they were not, let's say, universally played all over Iran, although we really don't know because there is no universal inventory of all these things. But let's say, like any games, all these things are fading away. I mean, like not only in Iran, but like I said, in the rest of the world as well. But yes, these games and I wouldn't be surprised if they're still being game, given also the fact that in this country, for example, the United States I'm talking about right now, role-playing games are being so popular, and these games are really indeed. You had both male and female versions. Basically, let's say, were very intimate and gave the possibility to the players to be inventive and creative. So it really, let's say, was a get together that had both, let's say, serious and not so serious elements in it.
And so quickly on that, were these, again, in ancient times, more specific to sort of the elite and the royals, or no?
Oh, no. This was
people.
This had,
Was it commoner?
it had nothing to do
working
with the upper caste. That was the people.
I
And
see.
culture basically is well, in sociology they always make a difference between high culture and low culture. And the culture, if you can speak of a nation, is basically born by what we call low culture, and because they maintain the continuity, because the ones on top every few decades of centuries get kicked out, and you get a change of the guard. But the bulk of the population remains, and they are all in remote areas and have very little contact with the outside world. And don't forget, I mean, Iran as a country is a very young country, in the sense that, let's say, if you talk to somebody from Sirjan, which is in the province in southeastern province, and you would ask, let's say, what his knowledge about the world was, let's say 100 years ago, he would say, I would go to the city, Sharmiran. He meant Kerman, not Tehran. I had no idea. We nowadays, with internet and television, etc., we have no idea how isolated people were in the good old days. It was also dangerous to get outside, by the way. And so, let's say, all these very ancient customs remained in place, and fortunately a lot of people nowadays have been collecting all, not only the songs but also these games and plays that were being played. Unfortunately, still not complete, but as I said, there are at least an inventory of 2,500.
I see. I want to go back to polo, if I may briefly, Dr. Shahabi, and if it's okay, could you tell us? I mean, the question might be a bit simple, but I know there's a lot to it. The role of horses. Horse has always been such a sort of bold and prominent and unique figure in Persian and Iranian art and culture, and in this case, sport. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of horses, in ancient Iran, and its significance, and how it continued into sort of the modern day?
Well, Iran is a very mountainous country. Most of Iran is mountainous, so in the era before modern roads were built, the only way to get around would be on animals. Now, this could be for the caravans, it would be camels mostly. In the villages or in the town even, it could be a donkey. And for the tribal people, the various tribes like the Bakhtiaris and the Qashqais and so on, they had horses, as did royalty. I mean, all the courts of Iran had stables full of horses, and in fact, we have an interesting story about the horse stable of the Safavids, because in the Safavid period, the 16th and 17th century, there were guilds. And one important guild was the Guild of Prostitutes. And they, like any other guild, paid tax. But since the activity was an illicit activity, the state didn't know what to do with the tax collected from the Guild of Sex Workers. So that tax was dedicated to the maintenance of the horses, who are not human beings, and therefore the illicit money could be spent on them. So horses were quite important for, in the countryside where there were tribal groups, like, for instance, Turkoman horses. There is a particular race of small horses that is specific to Iran, and that was brought back from extinction only about 40 or 50 years ago by the efforts of this American woman who lived in Iran, Louise something, I forget her name. Her first name was Louise. And in the more settled areas, I think it was something for the local khans, for the local landowners, and so on.
Could you please remind us again, when was that period that you were with the sort of prostitution ring? When was
16th century, 17th century.
Okay, fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to stay on this topic with polo and sort of the different engagement around horses. Were there any competitions, sort of international competitions, or I suppose not so international, but between Persians and let's say the Indians or the Chinese? There's none of that. No,
there was far too little contact between these countries.
Okay,
and those few merchants, or occasional envoys who traveled from one country to another had better things to do than to play games.
Right, they didn't have time for that.
So the competitions there were, obviously, because a game of polo is played by two teams, right? So for
but
instance,
domestically, sort of in their city and in their community, rather than
Shah Abbas himself was a keen polo player, and I always wonder whether the opposing team would dare to win when the Shah is on the other side. Competitions there were, but the whole notion of a team representing a particular empire, I think, was alien to these times.
I see. Do any of you gentlemen have any thoughts on when that started, when sort of countries started playing games and sort of in the sort of ancient times? Any thoughts on that, Dr. Floor?
I don't think that the only wars were games. In fact, it's interesting. It sounds funny, but it is not. For example, from ancient times, we know, again, from the times of Cyrus, that people were hunting, and the hunt was actually not only to get game, but it also was a game in a sense. It was a training exercise for the military at the same time. And at the same time, they used it as a ruse to trick the enemy. And for example, and there are many examples, and not only Cyrus, but for example, Shah Abbas I took Kandahar in 1622, if I remember correctly, by just walking in while he was hunting with his. And so I would say, let's say, the international competition on horseback was war. And that's why sometimes they call it a war game.
I see. Very interesting. I want to take a step away from this topic and talk about children and some games that children were entertained by or played amongst each other, again from the ancient times, and sort of the legacy that it that is sort of carried through the centuries. Dr. Floor, could you tell us about that? And then Dr. Shahabi, I want to understand if children were involved in games of polo or any other games that you are aware of pertaining
Well,
your area.
children games were, of course, the most important ones. I mean, small children as yet are not yet working, and so they are very energetic. So there are hundreds of games, all kinds of games that you can think of, for very small children to older children. And you have games, let's say, the same games that are played both by adults and the let's say, the older children. And there are so many of them. I mean, in my book, I have only made a selection of them. And these games, let's say, can range from physical games, like I mentioned, tic-tac, very popular one, to, let's say, when they get older, when they have start learning, let's say, local lore, especially poems, then you get already the especially when they get older, of course, the musha'ara game, where, let's say, you say a poem or a strophe of a poem that ends on an M, and then I have to respond with a strophe that starts with an M, and that goes around. So there are there's an enormous variety of games where I mean kids, and those games, let's say, are often similar to what you have in the Western world. For example, I can't remember right now what it is called, but let's say somebody bends over and you jump over it. It was quite a normal game in Iran, played everywhere, and games, let's say, where people assumed all kinds of attitudes and you had to copy them. I mean, the variety is amazing, and so and you find them all over Iran. Interesting, of course, I have to admit that, let's say, that the information all is almost directly related to the remoteness of the province. For example, in Balochistan, you will get less info, and Seistan and Balochistan get less information, let's say, than you get from Fars. But that's understandable. I don't hear you.
Specifically on the topic of children, Dr. Floor, could you tell us of the games that perhaps were more unique to the elite, or and games that were common to sort of, you know, the working class? Can you share any specifics?
I don't think, let's say, there were for certainly for children, I don't think there's at least I don't know of any evidence that there was difference between working class and the aristocracy. I mean, in the first place, the aristocracy was a very small layer, and they were not as distant from the rest of the society as they were, let's say, in Western Europe, and so they played the same type of games. Where you get, let's say, differences is where, let's say, education played a role, and of course there the children of aristocrats played more of those types of games than others.
And you know,
They also played with each other. I mean, it's not as though society was so segregated. I mean,
exactly.
The children of the elite played with the children of their servants.
Yep.
And they played the same games.
Yep.
Exactly. That's the point I wanted to raise. That is, you know, sort of the nannies or the maids and the housekeepers and the servants at the time were those taking care of the children, and so their culture and practices would naturally.
Servants were part of the family. They were not seen as separate from the family. And so those relationships lasted for life. So in that respect, what you may not see, let's say, that the children of the elite might play in the streets with kids, or even that I would not exclude. But I mean, that's where a lot of games were played, in the streets. Now, the aristocrats
or in
are
the fields adjacent to the city.
Yeah, and of course, the aristocrats didn't live in small houses. They had a big house in an even bigger garden. And so that's where they played their games.
Were there any games that children for sure had to learn in school? I mean, obviously in ancient times, you know, sort of the modern schools as we know it now just didn't exist, and sort of the forms were different back then. But were there any sports that they had to know for sure? I'm thinking perhaps boys, did they have to learn games of war, as you mentioned, or horseback riding or polo? Was there something mandatory that children?
Well, let's say kids, of course, learn from kids. There was no formal training. I mean, the kid of 2 years old followed his brother or her sister and copied what they were doing. This is like everywhere in the world. Now, as far as games like where you basically had to be wealthy, because don't forget, a horse costs a lot of money.
Yes.
Not only buying it, but also maintenance. And so unless, let's say, you were part of a tribal community where you grew up with horses, most people had no horse at all. As Dr. Shahabi already mentioned, I mean, in villages you had donkeys or mules, rarely horses, and camels, depending on the area again. Yes, and it's true, let's say, that for certain games where you needed implements, and I think Dr. Shahabi will talk about it, well, the Zurkhan, for example, you needed implements, you needed money. And not only that, you needed to have a good diet in order to develop sufficient muscles. And unfortunately, most people in Iran, depending on where you lived and what year it was and how the harvest was, did not have the best of diets.
The other thing is that the distinction between child and adult is perhaps not as distinctly drawn in a traditional society. I mean, children grow up with adults, and then, for instance, when it comes to the tribal populations or the those populations that have horses, the children grow up with horses, and they see them around, not in the cities where they were a rare thing, but if you are a Bakhtiari or a Turkmen child, horses are around you all the time. So you are socialized. Part of your upbringing is gradually to learn how to ride a horse.
So perhaps is it safe to say that one of the first pets, for children in Iran were horses?
I think pet is also a very Eurocentric notion.
Okay.
I mean, we have a few examples of people taking a particular liking to one animal, a little lamb, for instance, or dogs were mostly used for hunting. Cats, yes, cats were pets. Cats are by definition pets, but dogs were only.
Well, yeah, the Thule dog was a typical pet for. But again, that was for people who could afford it.
Yeah. So.
So a horse is not considered a pet, or.
I don't think anybody considered a horse a pet.
No.
I don't think in Europe anybody considers a horse a pet.
Either.
Perhaps a little Shetland pony, which is tiny and which plays dog, but other than that, horses I don't think are pets. Yeah.
No.
Like a little rabbit, for instance.
I want to move directions. I mean, I think all these topics we can spend hours on. But Dr. Shahabi, let's talk about modern sort of Zulkhane. Let's move into modern Iran and talk about Zulkhane, because I have a lot of questions to ask. But please tell us about Zulkhane, its history.
Yeah, Zulkhane is an institution. The earliest mentioning of it we have is again in Safavid times. And if I can have picture 12, picture 12. Yes, yeah. Here you see a depiction of something resembling a Zulkhane. It's from Chardin. And next one, please. Here you see it again. Again, you see what you see is a pit. It's a pit with athletes exercising inside it and musicians accompanying it, the exercises, so that the exercises, rather like a modern aerobic session, take place while a drummer provides the rhythm for many of these exercises. This was basically the gymnasium of urban Iran. Men who wanted to be physically active went there to exercise. It was also a place of sociability. Different people from the neighborhood joined in, artisans, merchants, basically a cross-section of the population. It was relatively rare, if not very rare, for members of the elite to descend into the Zulkhane. So unlike polo, Zulkhane always was a very popular kind of activity. And I think it had its heyday perhaps in the late 19th century, but then with the introduction of modern Western sports, it declined, also because it had a relatively negative reputation in the population, actually, because many of the people who went there were quite unsavory characters, to put it mildly. So it declined, and then it was revived to some extent when the Iranian state celebrated the 1000th anniversary of Ferdowsi. And then under the Shah, it was given some sponsorship, but it has remained a marginal phenomenon. Most Iranian men do not identify with the Zulkhane. I mean, if you want to be an athlete in Iran today, you play football or volleyball or basketball, or you go swimming, but it's a niche kind of thing. But since it incorporates so many Iranian traditions, it's culturally interesting. And of course, before the revolution and even now, it's a place where tourists are very often taken because there's good music, there's good singing, there's good drumming, and the athletes perform for you. But it's, I think, on the whole, it remains a marginal phenomenon.
I always see it as sort of a multifold sport. I mean, it's entertainment, it's performative, it's theatrical, it has so much to do with religion. I want to ask you about that. Tell us about the role that religion played in Zulkhane.
The traditional Zulkhane definitely had a sacred character. For instance, it was said that an athlete couldn't enter the, perhaps we should change the picture. Could I have picture 17, please? Yeah, this is what a Zulkhane looks like now today. You have the athletes standing around with, and in this particular exercise, this is a spinning exercise, which is called charh in Persian. And so you see that many of these men with their big bellies don't look like the ideal athlete for today's youth. And when a young Iranian man thinks of an athletic body, that's not what he thinks about. And it's and for instance, here in the background, you have the picture of Imam Ali. I don't know if you see it. Yep. So there is definitely a religious dimension, because many of these zurkhanes contain elements of Sufi culture. This shouldn't be exaggerated, but there is some kind of identification with the general culture of Sufism. And of course, Ali is the founder of Sufism as far as Sufis are concerned. So Ali is very present there. And as I said before, traditionally, in order to enter the pit that you can see here, a man had to have done his ablutions, his wuzu. So, and every session begins with prayers for the departed, for those who are present, for those who have paid for the session, and so on. So there's definitely a religious element. This religious element was downplayed before the revolution, but after the revolution, for obvious reasons, it was reinserted. Because that was one way to legitimate an institution which had fallen into some disrepute before the revolution.
Fascinating. And could you tell us when this religious aspect and element entered Zurkhane? Was it always there, or throughout time it evolved? I imagine, when given Imam Ali's significant presence there, was it after Shiism became the dominant religion in Iran, or what was it like before? Did religion play a role before? Or...
Well, let me preface what I have to say by making clear that we know very, very little about the history of the Zurkhane. Since, for instance, unlike polo, which was an elite game that people wrote about, for instance, the Qabusnameh, my favorite Persian text from classical literature, has an entire chapter on polo, but it has no chapter on the Zurkhane, because it was, as I said, an urban phenomenon for the popular classes, and therefore it wasn't taken seriously enough to be written about. So what we have is little hints here and there in autobiographies and biographies and so on. The hypothesis that is emerging now is that originally these were sort of guilds of itinerant wrestlers who went around towns to perform, also to fight against each other for money, for prize money. And every aristocrat, every shah, every king had a stable of wrestlers who would fight against each other, Nowruz, for instance. But then, in order to give themselves respectability, these guilds began adopting Sufi rituals. And for instance, the person who drums, who promotes the drumming in recent centuries, has been known as Morshed. And Morshed is, of course, the word used for a Sufi master. So this is a hypothesis that I personally believe in. I cannot prove it, that the introduction of these religious elements is basically an effort to make it legitimate in the population. But today it is definitely a very Shiite-infused institution, even though it has spread to Sunni areas in Iran. For instance, in Sunni Kurdistan, we also have Zurkhanes. In the 1940s and 1950s, there were actually two Jewish Zurkhanes in Iran. In Yazd, there was a Zoroastrian Zurkhane. So it's spread to the general population, but originally it's very much Shi'i. Yeah.
I see. Just my last question on Zurkhane. Music also plays a big role. You mentioned drums and the Morshed singing, or please correct me, of course, but telling a story or reciting a poem of sort. Is that the only game that has so much involvement of music, or are there other games? And perhaps Dr. Floor, you can chime in as well. But I am curious to know what other games from ancient times to sort of modern times were there that had this marriage with music.
Yeah, in the Zurkhane, as the picture of Karsten Niebuhr that I showed shows, you had musicians actually playing wind instruments. But here you find, on the sides, for instance, on the left, there you find a real group of musicians playing. However, I think at the end of the Safavid period, when sort of a more pietistic and more literal version of Islam became dominant in Iran because of the influence of the Majlisi brothers, the instruments disappeared, and what remained was the drum. What remained was the drum, and this is the case even today. There's only a drummer. However, the drummer accompanies himself by singing. And the melodies, the tunes that are used are the same melodies and tunes that are used in classical Persian music. So these are musicians, except they would never call themselves musicians, because again, there's a stigma attached to being a musician. So, and the poetry, yes, contrary to what many people believe, the poetry was not the Shahnameh, because the rhythmic structure of the Shahnameh doesn't lend itself. For instance, when I attended Zurkhanes in Iran, occasionally I would hear poems by Saadi, by Rumi, by Hafiz, and so on. So every morshed has a repertoire of poems that he knows by heart. And since you asked about women before, one of the most interesting phenomena of the last 20 years is that an institution where women were not allowed to set foot until the early 20th century is now being opened to women. So there are a number of women who are now practicing what is known as ancient sport. And I think the last picture I have shows that. See here, this is one of the instruments used in the exercise, which is a bow made of metal rings, which one swings over one's body. And it's a matter of big controversy in Iran right now, whether women can or cannot participate. Of course, if they do, it will be in a segregated way, unless, of course, the woman is covered like this. But this is a very interesting modern phenomenon.
I see. Dr. Floor, would you like to add anything to the discussion, your thoughts on Zurkhane?
Well, what I would like to say, let's say that wrestling per se was, of course, much older than the Zurkhane phenomenon. And we have, let's say, we don't have, as far as I can recall, any evidence of written sources, in written sources for the imperial period. But let's say in the Abbasid court, and the Ghaznavid court, the Ilkhanid court, wrestling was part and parcel of the amusements at court. And don't forget, the courts were very military in character. And let's say, talking about the Safavid, you had the Zurkhane, but at the same time, you had other rough and tumble games. One of them was, for example, called Das Bazi, and in which even the Shah participated, by the way. And
what is Das Bazi?
Yeah, well, basically, you tried to grab your partner by his belt and throw him off on the ground. And for example, that was played by the Shahs with his emirs, and especially when they were younger, of course. That was a friendly game, and was for fun. As far as the origins of Zurkhane is concerned, it's a little bit controversial. There are people who are linking them to the Ayar movement. Now, the Ayar movement is something very complicated. I won't go into that. But let's say it was a movement that started in the early, let's say, at least 1,000 already in the Abbasid period, which is, let's say, the 9th century. And often, let's say, they were fighters for the faith, and they formed then special groups with their own customs and their own arms and their own spiritual ideology, which was again linked to Sufism. And but let's say, as I said, Ayari is a really complicated matter, and that would require a separate session because it is not easy, as the meaning of the term also changes over time, and that makes it more complicated.
You know, for me, as someone who really knows not much about sports and games in general, you know, as a journalist, I never cover sports unless it has something to do with politics. And I always found it fascinating how politics and political matters found its way into sports and games. And when thinking about Zulkhane, the first thing that comes to my mind is this culture of pahlevan, you know, standing truth to power, good versus evil, you know, poor versus rich, fighting for the oppressed. Dr. Shahabi, could you tell us a little bit about this culture? And if I recall, you know, from what I know from the Qajar era, you know, that culture of pahlevan Salari was so bold then. Was it older? Was it more dominant then? Tell us a little bit about that. And then
I think this notion that the Pahlavan is a noble person who defends the poor against the rich is a recent idea that comes in the 1920s and 30s. In olden times, Pahlavan is a synonym for wrestler. A wrestler is called a Pahlavan, especially a wrestler who is good at it. Not perhaps a novice, but if you know, an adult man who is a good wrestler is called a Pahlavan. That's all it is.
Not necessarily for good purposes. Is that then?
No. These were entertainers. I mean, these were entertainers who entertained the court and went around the city, and you know, and not many of them were not good. In fact, one of the greatest champions of late 19th century Qajar Iran sometimes poisoned his opponents because he didn't want to fight them, or you know, it's well known that pederasty was quite widespread among them, and that's why the institution had on the whole a bad reputation in the population. So in what happens in the 1920s and 1930s is that after, as I said, after the introduction of modern sports, there were some people who wanted to save that, save this tradition. And what I forgot to mention, which Dr. Floor mentioned, is that traditionally all the Zulkhane exercises, of which there were 5 or 6, were nothing but preparations for wrestling. Wrestling was the final exercise. And so these were bodybuilding exercises to prepare wrestlers, right? Except that in the 1930s, modern wrestling, freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling, was introduced in Iran. And so they stopped wrestling in the Zulkhane. The Zulkhane is no longer a place where one goes for wrestling. It's a place where one goes for physical exercise, right? And so again, it's this notion that the Pahlavan is the noble defender of the righteous and poor. That is all part of this mythology that was created in the 1920s and 1930s in order to make the institution palatable again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I may add to that. It also has to do, let's say, with the labels that were used. They were also referred to as Jawan Mardan, which has a positive connotation. They were called Luti Gars, which also has a positive name. But you know, the point is, human beings in general don't fight for good. They usually fight for bad. And when you look at the stratification, and we're talking here about urban areas, but even in rural areas, which we can talk about later, let's say you had a number of, the governor, of course, and his court, and then you had a number of powerful local families, whether secular or religious. And they made use of strongmen. Now, where do you hire strongmen? From the Zurkhane.
And where do you get strong in the first place? You get strong
exactly.
in the Zurkhane.
And these people, let's say, were sometimes used if somebody said, I don't agree with the policy of the governor, of, for example, of fixing the price of bread at a certain price, then it looks like he was fighting for the good. In fact, he was fighting with a political opponent. And he used the fact that the price of bread was raised as an excuse, not that he cared about the price of bread. So I think we have to be very careful how to interpret those phenomena.
It's fascinating. And I'm really glad I asked the question because I learned a whole lot. I want to move on. I'm being cognizant of time, and I want to go to a completely different game, and that is mind games that exist. I mean, is it correct to say poker was, it's very savvy. It needed this savvy mind, a smart brain to play it. And Dr. Floor, you mentioned how it's evidence شهر سوخته in Sistan, Baluchistan. Tell us about that. Tell us about the sort of legacy of game of poker.
Well, board games and card games, both you need to use your brain to develop a strategy. Now, board games are very old. I mean, we have found board games that are at least 8,000 years old. We don't know how they were played because, they are part of archaeological finds like in Shahrazad, etc. And we know, let's say, for example, from the Iliad, that in that part of the world there also were board games. We don't know whether we played. Now, Czech that was probably imported from India, at least that's what the sources tell us, and was introduced to Iran, and then from there passed on via the Arabs to the Western world. And but even that game was not necessarily played as it's played nowadays. You had, for example, you had round games, you had square games, you had games with more or less pieces on the board. There were initially a variety of these games. Also, maybe interesting the game of Jack ends either as in draw or in checkmate, and everybody thinks that the checkmate comes from Arabic Shah Mat. Shah from Persian king, Mat, the perfect from Mata in Arabic, meaning to kill, die. Now, it actually is Persian Mat, which you find in the Shahnameh, for example, and it means that you're defenseless. And so Shah Mat was basically the Shah lost. And so there are, let's say, there were more board games. Let's say backgammon was very popular as well. Then you had card.
But I wanted to go to backgammon.
Yeah.
Definitely, that's an area that I want to touch on. So please elaborate on it. Yes.
Well, backgammon, oh my God, that is probably the most popular game ever in the Middle East. It's played, and still played, by the way, everywhere in the Middle East, and also outside the Middle East. It has become very popular, and I never won. I was always beaten. I think I was already beaten before I started, because the people I played were so experienced. But you grow up with it, because it's like with the horses. it's played at home, and so you see people playing, so you learn while on the job, so to speak. And yeah, I mean it's a game. It's in the air. I mean you cannot go around and not see it somewhere.
Sure.
Um,
Pardon if I may interrupt. On the topic of backgammon and tachte, I mean, it's a game that takes a long time.
yes.
Same as chess. What does that tell us about the society at the time, and as we sort of moved on? You know, people did in fact spend time playing
Yeah, but they
with
have.
one
Yeah,
another.
but yeah, I don't think, let's say, that that is societal related, because other societies, people had more time. I mean, now what we forget nowadays, everybody has this iPhone, and if he or she is not looking at it constantly, and it is literally the religious icon, and if it beeps, then they have to look at it immediately and respond. In the good old days, fortunately, you didn't have it, and so things were at a much slower pace. Everything happened with a delay, so to speak, and therefore you had more time. And
Did women play backgammon?
excuse me?
Oh, yeah.
Did women play backgammon
Yes.
in the sort of
Yes.
ancient times?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would
What
say
other
everybody,
games were women?
everybody played gap.
I mean, I know we talked about theatrical games and so forth, but are there any other games that we missed to identify that women were involved in?
Let me
Cards,
see.
backgammon.
Let me see. I mean, well,
Dr. Shah,
what I
feel
would
free to
like,
chime in.
what I would like to mention there, let's say, there is part. There are other board games, let's say, as Doesbazi, Hash. For example, Hash Pie is a board game. It looks a little bit like chess. It's already known from the Parthian times. Actually, we have a description how it was played from Lahr in the 1950s. It's very complicated game, like any board game, by the way. And then we have, for example, a game that is called Pichaz. The only thing that we know about it is that it was played in Safavid times. It mentioned, I think, in Tariq al-Amaraya Abbasi. We know from an ethnographic study that it actually 50 years was still played in Gilan, but how it was played, we don't know. So so there are these board games. But other, let's say, mind games are card games, of course, and card games are very old. We know at least from the 14th century that the Ganjave was played, for example, and that was played until certainly on the beginning of the 20th century. And then there was another game, As or As-Nas, which some people consider to be the grandfather of poker.
Yes, that's
and
what I
it
was
was
asking.
probably learned by a Frenchman who was in the 1830s in Iran, and took the game back to Europe, and I wouldn't say improved it, but changed it, and so but otherwise, I mean, yeah. Then the other mind game is, let's say, the poetic games. Either mushare, as I said, you start set in, and then it's a give or take, and it goes on as long as you can. There were training manuals for that. Then you had, let's say, the same similar kind of games among dervishes, a certain dervish group, so Ghanbari, where one started with a poem, and you had then to answer in the same style and meter of the first poem, and that could go on for hours. And that shows you, let's say, both the knowledge and good memory and wit of the people concerned.
I could add
certainly.
something. One of the interesting things
Yes.
about tahte, backgammon, is that it's a combination of mind game and game of chance.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's different from chess or from a mushaira, which are only mind games because you throw the dice, right? And so this combination of a game of chance and mind game is, I think, what makes it so attractive.
I want to ask the audience to feel free to write their questions in the Q&A. We are going to go for another 10-15 minutes, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to ask your questions as well. There are a lot of questions about Yerol Dorol. Can you tell us about that, perhaps Dr. Flor, if you wish, as well as yes, Yerol Dorol و تیله‌بازی. About Yerol Dorol. The question is about Yerol Dorol and تیله‌بازی for children.
Which game was that? Because I didn't hear that properly.
No. Yes, about Yerol Dorol and playing with little rocks for children.
Oh yeah, well, there are games for children are so many. I mean, the list is, for example, you had a game was called Shikar Bazi, the hunting game, where kids, let's say, played how to hunt animals and so imitating some as much, let's say, their parents, because in the rural areas it's quite normal that not everybody, but let's say you had a special number of people who were specialized in that, and they were hunters, and so they did that sort of thing, and then that was for very small children, by the way. And then, for example, what was a very popular game in Iran, not only in Iran, but also, let's say, in Europe, kite flying. It's not, let's say, that Iranian children played, let's say, games that we don't know. No, they played games that were, because all these games are basically invented by people to amuse themselves and to keep busy, and so it's either an imitation of what adults do, or either an imitation of what other, let's say, what animals do, or events that have taken place, and so.
Game, you just made me think of a question that I think it might be interesting for the audience. Was there a game that was created strictly for political reasons or personal reasons instead of it being strictly entertainment?
I personally don't know of any game that was, let's say, before the modern times, when they invented Monopoly and that sort of thing, that a game was invented. I mean, well, any game was invented at a certain time, of course. I don't think that any game was invented for political reasons, although they may have been used for political reasons. And I can't think offhand of one, but let's say any popular manifestation where you have a group of people together can be used for political purpose, but that is not, let's say, the essence of a certain game.
Sense. Dr. Shahabi, someone's asking about wrestling, and the question is, can you tell us a bit more about how it became a national sport? Do you consider it a national sport? Why?
When modern sports were introduced in Iran, and in the 1930s, there was a particular effort to introduce basketball, volleyball, and football in the schools, for instance. The only modern sports that had roots in the country was freestyle wrestling, because the traditional wrestling style of the Zurkhane is very similar to freestyle wrestling. So for that reason, countries in which that was the case did particularly well in international championships. For instance, the first medal that an Iranian ever gained at Olympic Games was actually by a weightlifter, which is also a heavy sport. But then after that, up to this day, most Olympic medals that Iranians win are in wrestling. Iranians win world championships in wrestling and so on. And so, since on the international level, that was the only sport that, together with weightlifting to some extent, but the two are connected. Since that was the only sport that Iranians saw gold medals in, where the Iranian flag would go up and so on, it became very popular. And it was, I think, Iran's most popular sport until the 1960s. Everybody followed it on radio, everybody followed it later on television, in the newspapers, and so on. And I think it's only in the late 1960s, early 1970s that football or soccer became more popular in Iran. So it is a national sport, but that doesn't mean that it is the most popular sport.
Talking about
sort of like baseball in America.
Yes, indeed. Talking about soccer or football, as we call it in Iran, someone's asking the question about the roots of this game in Iran. Did it come via the English and through sort of colonizing impact, or no? Does it have sort of longer roots that go back to ancient
No,
Iran?
it came very much through the English. The first people who played soccer in Iran were the English employees of the oil company in the north, in the south, of the Imperial Bank, of various schools. And so what happened, I mean, this is something that has been documented. These English or British people, at one point in Abadan, there was even a England versus Scotland a soccer game. So they played soccer with each other, and the Iranians sort of watched, curious. And then every now and then they would join in. When the British team and an English team needed an extra player, they would say, okay, Hassan, you come and replace. And so more and more Iranians started playing until they put up their own teams. And so that's basically the history of the introduction. In Isfahan, there was an effort to introduce cricket, but that didn't catch on. So in today's Iran, the only area of the country where cricket is played is Balochistan, and that's a Pakistani influence. But the soccer was very much introduced by the English, and interestingly enough, even though soccer is relatively unpopular in the United States, American missionaries in Iran also popularized soccer. Dr. Jordan, for instance, who was the director of Al Borz College for the longest time, he thought that by making his pupils play soccer, he taught them team spirit, because Iranians have a reputation of being individualists. And for instance, all the medals that Iranians won until recently are all in individual sports. I mean, weightlifting and wrestling and taekwondo and so on are not team sports. And so the idea was to overcome this alleged Iranian inability to cooperate. One had to teach boys to play soccer from a very early age. And that's why soccer was introduced in Iranian high schools in the 1930s, and gradually it took off.
Amazing. I am being cognizant of time. Dr. Flor, would you like to add anything to that? If not, I would like to ask a sort of broad general question from you both to leave the discussion. I certainly learned a lot. Dr. Flor? Would you like to add anything to what Dr.
You have to unmute yourself.
About soccer or wrestling, sir? Unmute. Let me ask Negar or the host to. Dr.
Yes.
Flor, would you like to add anything about soccer or wrestling as we wrap the conversation?
Soccer was, let's say, introduced indeed by the English, not so much by the oil people, but the missionaries, and they played it at their schools. And in fact, the first description that we have it is when Zilla Sultan's sons who was the governor of Isfahan, were taken to a game in 1898 where they were played, and American, let's say, and then it was also played by missionaries elsewhere, and so from there it took off. But it's certainly, let's say, the English that introduced it.
Very good. My last question to you both as we wrap the conversation is, right now looking at today's Iran, the role of sports, the role of games, what does that tell us about the society, and sort of where do you think or see it going? Whether it's these individual sports that women are part of. I mean, Iran has a very active sort of Paralympic team, as challenging as the circumstances are for these athletes. They're still working hard in these sports. Soccer, of course, is a huge part of the Iranian society right now. Taekwondo, as you mentioned, Dr. Shahabi. If you can just, in a minute or two, each of you, tell us your thoughts on this and sort of today's Iran and the youth of Iran, and where you see the role of games and sports for the years to come.
Well, it has, in some sports have become very politicized. I mean, football is very politicized. There are some teams that are associated with political movements. For instance, Tractor Sazi of Tabriz is very much identified with Azeri nationalism. And the presence of women in the stadiums, of course, as you know, is one of the most long-lasting issues in Iranian politics, where the government goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The segregation, of course, the sexual segregation practiced in public spaces is very much an issue. One interesting thing is that there is a renewal of interest in regional folk sports, which had been disappearing, as Dr. Flo mentioned. But in many provinces in Iran, a regional consciousness is now emerging in reaction to this standardization of culture that we see everywhere in the world. And so there are genuine efforts by local people to revive and to participate in these games.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Shahabi. Dr. Floor, any final thoughts from you?
Well, the only thing I would like to add is that I think more sports are being played right now in Iran than before. Oh, secondly, rather ironically, more women participate in sports nowadays, although there's a special dress code. By the way, for men, there is also a special dress code. And there are, for example, there were even, in Iran participated, women's Islamic games were held. So in that respect, you could say there is a positive development. Women's games are still, of course, segregated, but I think it is healthy that more people are playing sports, and I think and that women are also doing that. And some of the Iranian women are doing quite well in the international level, which is I think is a good thing.
And it's a recent phenomenon.
Yeah,
absolutely. And again, despite all the challenges, it's a marvelous reality to see, and of course look forward to. Dr. Hussein Shahabi, Dr. Willem Floor, thank you so much for your time. I certainly learned a whole lot. I also want to thank Dr. Mostofi and everyone at Georgetown's Persian Studies program who make these webinars possible. This program will be on YouTube, and for folks who weren't able to join it live, they would have an opportunity to watch it later. Thank you so much to the both of you, and I look forward to more discussions.
Thank Thank you so much, Ms. Kangarloo. Thank you to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Shahabi and Dr. Floor. On behalf of Professor Mustafi and the Persian Studies program, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today and for your questions. Again, as Ms. Kangarloo mentioned, this event was recorded and you can find it on the Persian Studies website later. Again, thank you so much. خیلی ممنون. روز خوبی داشته باشیم و خدا نگهدار.
Bye bye.